D&D is one of the best tabletop role-playing games out there, and definitely my favorite. With all the freedom you have in this open-world adventure, the possibilities are nearly limitless for what your characters can do. But sometimes, as a DM, what you've planned for the session falls a little flat, and the social interaction, exploration, and combat don't meet your standards. So let's take a journey to look at other games, and how they handle these elements, and try to learn from them for our future sessions. This is definitely not just an excuse for me to play video games on Twitch. It's time to level up.
Originally released in 1996 for the Sony PlayStation and remade in 2002 for the Nintendo GameCube, Resident Evil is the classic survival horror video game and is credited with popularizing the entire genre. In comparison to most modern games, it features an unusual camera setup and control scheme that can take some getting used to. Everything from the game's exploration to its puzzle solving to its combat requires patience and careful consideration. Overall, it's a masterclass of how lots of little design decisions can culminate to a video game that stands the test of time. Hi, I'm John from Incendium D&D, and welcome to Level Up, our video series on how to become better game masters by analyzing our favorite games. Now, Resident Evil may not be the most intuitive place to start our journey, but that's exactly the reason I wanted to start here. In my experience, the best TTRPG sessions I've been a part of on either side of the screen were so great because of their superior design. And great game design tends to be a culmination of a lot of little decisions that end up working seamlessly together to create an amazing experience. And I've had a lot of conversations with other game masters where they spend a lot of their prep time, say on a single boss fight or a well-executed twist. But a lot of times, that one thing ends up falling flat because it isn't being supported by the other little design decisions that make it meaningful. Now, before diving in, I just want to clear something up. As we talk about Resident Evil today, I'm really going to be focusing on the remake from 2002. While I respect the PlayStation original for popularizing the survival horror genre and spawning the franchise, in terms of analyzing great game design, in my opinion, the remake is of superior quality. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
Resident Evil.
Resident Evil tells the story of Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield, two police officers that are part of the Raccoon City Police Department's STARS Alpha team. Basically, it's a fictional SWAT team. Recently, Raccoon City has been plagued by a series of bizarre murders where victims have been apparently eaten. While investigating the nearby forest for the perpetrators, STARS Bravo team went missing, and it's up to Alpha team to find them. Upon investigating the crash site of Bravo team's helicopter, Alpha team is attacked by zombie dogs and forced to take refuge in a nearby mansion that houses its own undead horrors. Throughout the game, players discover documents that slowly unveil the mystery of the mansion, complete deadly puzzles, and fight the mansion's zombified inhabitants. Like I mentioned earlier, the first thing that most modern gamers will probably notice is that the player has no control over the game's camera. The camera is in a series of static positions, meaning that as the player character navigates the environment, the camera is constantly switching positions. Because of this, the game uses tank controls, meaning that pressing up on a control stick moves the player character forward relative to where they are in the environment, not relative to where they are in the camera's frame. Your character can't even move and shoot at the same time. This combination of static, shifting camera angles and an unintuitive, esoteric control scheme can be disorienting, and turns a lot of people away from even giving the game an honest try. While this would normally be frustrating for a game with a different tone, it ends up being perfect for a slow-paced horror game. Because the designers are in control of the camera, they can use it to hide enemies around corners. Often, when you enter a new area, the first thing you'll notice is the sound of zombies moaning in the distance. You know they're there, but you can't see them. The suspense builds as you draw closer, heightening the suspense as you carefully investigate. It's a brilliant example of how the player's relationship with the game's environment can be manipulated by changing which sense the player uses to detect threats. The camera is also often angled cinematically to change the player's relationship with their environment. In his book, The Art of Game Design, Jesse Schell discusses the relationship between a player and their in-game avatar, in this case Jill or Chris. In the case of Resident Evil, I always found myself projecting onto my in-game character. I'll wince if they get hurt and feel dread when they're bitten by a zombie. And the way the camera changes position, therefore, always gave me a sensation I was being watched. It never feels like the usual camera to avatar relationship, where as a player, you're cognitive of the fact that you're watching your character. It's good to remember that this connection with a player and their character is only heightened in TTRPGs. I've had more conversations than I can reasonably count with players who tell me that their characters they play in a TTRPG are really aspects of themselves. Sometimes those traits are exaggerated, sometimes not so much. For example, when my wife and I play Dungeons & Dragons together, she tends to have kind of a hard time if her character ever gets targeted by an attack or a spell. She'll exclaim, "Why are they targeting me?" In those cases, there's almost no separation between her in-game character and her real-world self. And this is also why character death in-game, whether it's an NPC or a player character, can evoke real-world grief. It's just something to keep in mind as a game master. Getting back to Resident Evil, this static camera setup is also why the game's graphics have aged like fine wine. By keeping the game's camera static, the game's designers could craft the game's background with high-quality images rather than 3D models, resulting in an environment that requires less processing power. Because of that, the game's processing power could be used for character models instead, resulting in visuals that were groundbreaking for the time. While graphical fidelity isn't exactly something most game masters have to concern themselves with, there is an abstract lesson we can learn here, and that is choosing how we distribute our processing power. In the case of Resident Evil, the static camera angles have a very functional role in the game's processing, as well as having strong thematic and immersive functions. This is a game intended to scare you. What better way to scare you than to make player character control difficult and to hide enemies? Anytime you're a game master, whether you recognize it or not, you're also a game designer. You're designing each session, whether you're using published tools like from the Monster Manual or creating tools of your own. How are you spending your time preparing each session? How much of that time are you considering how your players are going to receive your descriptions and design choices? And how much of that time are you considering how much you can reasonably process and keep track of while you're running your game? But let's continue on to what I think is Resident Evil's core mechanic, and also one that's easy to implement into almost any TTRPG I can think of. Limited inventory. In Resident Evil, your character has precious few slots for items they can carry with them. Combat items like weapons, ammo, and healing items take up room needed for key items that allow you to progress. Throughout the game, you'll find yourself constantly rearranging your resources to appropriately prepare for whatever you may encounter. And to progress, you'll always need at least 1 or 2 open slots to pick up keys and key items. This leads to an increased amount of thoughtfulness in what items you take with you and which you leave behind. For example, even after you obtain the shotgun, you may want to store it in the item box since it has less available ammunition to find. Then again, even though the handgun has more ammo to find, it's a far less reliable weapon when it comes to finishing off enemies. It's why I found Jill's campaign to be easier for me starting out. She starts with 2 extra item slots, which is a lifesaver in a game predicated on inventory management. It also makes the constant running back and forth between new areas and item boxes much less tedious. I mean, even saving at one of the mansion's typewriters requires the use of an ink ribbon, which is a limited use item. Each time you make progress in the game, you have to determine if what you've accomplished is worth protecting with one of your precious few ink ribbons, or if you should risk trying to make a little bit more progress to get the most out of each one. Just this little choice presents a consequence for something that's a no-brainer in any other game. And this too adds to the game's tone of horror. Resident Evil isn't just scary because the zombies look gross. Part of the game's fear is the possibility that you'll lose a significant amount of progress, but you're constantly negotiating with yourself if what you've done is worth enough to use one of your precious few ink ribbons. Even a small decision like saving your game has a heavy toll, which of course makes making each of those decisions more meaningful. As a player, your choices matter because there's a real mechanical consequence for whatever you choose. Sure, using your strongest weapon and ammo can mean an easier encounter now, but it may mean lacking a much needed asset in a future fight. If you know what you're doing, then you can reasonably finish the game with an abundance of ammo, healing items, and ink ribbons. At least on the difficulty I play on. But for a new player, these gameplay elements are stressful and highlight how horror gameplay doesn't stop at visuals. It's seeped into the game's mechanics. A lot of times, I've found myself in conversations with game masters that are frustrated that their players aren't playing thoughtfully. I hear things like, my players always do the same thing in combat, or they're only bringing overpowered builds to the table. And these things are probably true, but I find that often the core reason has nothing to do with the players, but rather the design of the session. The pattern of designs that you implement session to session are going to encourage and discourage certain behaviors from your players. For example, if a lot of your combats are deadly and your monsters have really strong defenses, your players are probably going to pick combat optimized options. Likewise, if a lot of times they try something new and fail, they're probably going to want to use more reliable options where they know they're going to succeed. A good example is that in my earliest experiences with 5th edition, I genuinely believed that Fighter was an underpowered class. And the reason was that a lot of the sessions I'd participate in had this structure where we would fight one big boss at the end of the session, and then immediately get a long rest after. This meant that pretty much every player character could just Nova with their best abilities every fight. Spellcasters could just use their highest level spell slot, paladins didn't have to conserve their smites, and by comparison, fighters, they don't really Nova as well as some of those other classes. Because of that, fighters just ended up being less powerful because they weren't dealing as much damage or as big effects as quickly as some of the other classes. Now change the structure a little bit to maybe say 6 to 8 combat encounters per long rest. Fighter all of a sudden becomes a lot more reliable and a lot more consistent. Yeah, a wizard still has that big powerful spell, but they have to time when to use it correctly within those 6 to 8 fights. Just by changing something so simple as how often your player characters can recover can have a huge impact on how your players are perceiving the value of different features in the game. Also, just remember, if you plan on making an adjustment like that, where suddenly you're going to really reduce the number of long rests that your players get per fight, let them know about it ahead of time rather than just pulling the rug out from under them. Otherwise, you might be in for some frustration. So far, we've focused on some of the major game mechanics that make Resident Evil great, but that's only part of the story. Both Resident Evil and my favorite TTRPG sessions were great because their mechanics aligned with a defined tone. In Resident Evil's case, that tone is horror, which is conveyed through its aesthetic. One of the reasons I wanted to use the remake as my example is that its graphics are fantastic. I know I already mentioned it in terms of its function of saving on processing power, but even in our era of HD graphics and high frame rates, this game looks amazing for being 20 years old. The monsters' detailed character models and sound effects solidify a player's immersion in the virtual space. This is the power of interactive media. Direct visual and audio information in real time. So this is the part where I pop in a spicy take. I actually like running my games better online through a VTT. Like many game masters in 2020, I had to switch from game mastering in person to online, and I actually found I preferred it because what it allowed me to do was use additional assets in order to set a certain mood for a session. Suddenly, I could display artwork, control music, and because we're all in our own preferred environments, we're all at home and comfortable, individual players could even do things like tone down the volume of music for them, or shut it off entirely. And this just ended up being my ideal setup. Artwork and music can go a long way in helping establish and keep a certain mood at the table. I mean, just use this as an example. Now compare that to this. Visuals and audio are part of a game's aesthetic, but just one thing to be careful of is not to mistake aesthetic for the tone, because tone is both how aesthetic and game mechanics work together. Because although you can set up aesthetic with certain music and certain visuals, tone is achieved when you get the aesthetic and the game mechanics working together. One of the most common missteps I've experienced with game masters is misaligning their game's aesthetic with their game's mechanics. Funny enough, Resident Evil itself is a perfect example of this. Let's compare Resident Evil Remake with its critically acclaimed sequel, Resident Evil 4. In a lot of ways, these games share a lot of qualities. Both have gross-looking monsters, both have horror music, and in both, you can't move and shoot at the same time. But the key difference is their gameplay. In Resident Evil 4, the gunplay is a lot faster. Whereas in Remake, you really can kinda just point and aim at a zombie and hope that their head explodes. In Resident Evil 4, the player's new relationship between the camera and controls allows for precise targeting, which supersedes inventory management as the game's core mechanic. I mean, sure, you can run out of ammo in RE4, but oftentimes dead enemies will drop ammunition for you. Compare this to Remake, where there is a set amount of ammunition the player can collect through the mansion. Enemies don't drop ammunition when they die, meaning when you fire each round, that's one less round you can use for the rest of the game. In Remake, zombies can soak up handgun rounds as they shamble closer and closer to you, and you never really know which round will finish it. In comparison, RE4 features hordes of enemies that are individually easier to take down. But also because of this, RE4 makes you feel more powerful, especially when you take out a horde of enemies with a grenade or an explosive barrel. Because you feel more powerful, by extension, there's less suspense. Both games have a horror aesthetic in terms of visual and audio, but because of these significant gameplay differences, their tones are very different. And that isn't to say they aren't fun to play. I love both of these entries and replay them often, but if I'm looking for a horror game, Resident Evil 4 is not usually the first one that comes to mind. I've had my share of participating in sessions where there is this conflict between aesthetic and mechanics, and it ends up detracting from the tone. For example, I once played in this D&D campaign that was meant to be dark and gritty, where at any combat there was the possibility your character may die. But that ended up not really being the case, because mechanically our characters were able to level too quickly, so our characters became very powerful, and they were allowed to rest often. So even though the aesthetic was consistent with a dark and gritty world, the game mechanics worked against that feeling for us as players. And the campaign was fun, I'm glad I participated in it, but its overall goal of having a dark, gritty tone wasn't fulfilled. And I'll definitely throw myself under the bus here. There was a D&D campaign that I DM'd for, and it was meant to be kind of light and fun and silly, but because a lot of my combat encounters were a little bit more complex and challenging, it ended up leading to a lot of player frustration. Again, the aesthetic was definitely lighter spirited, but because the mechanics were much more demanding, it ended up leading to this conflict, and the tone wasn't quite right. Now that being said, I do have some success examples. One being Incendium D&D's Ian, who ran Curse of Strahd through a VTT, which let him set up the aesthetic of gothic horror, of using very detailed imagery and haunting music. And in addition, the gameplay matched it. A lot of the monsters we fought had these regeneration abilities, making them very difficult to defeat. And even though I was playing kind of a gothic horror character as I was playing a vampire, the tone was able to stay consistent because our gameplay experience and aesthetic experience lined up. In conclusion, Resident Evil is one of my favorite examples of specific and effective game design, and one that I think can provoke bigger questions that can make you a better game master. First, what is my game's tone, and how can I reinforce it? This could be everything from your game's aesthetic to combat difficulty to how many or how little resources your players have access to. Second, how am I using my processing power? And this is really a diagnosis on your energetic investment and time. Are you spending most of your time searching for artwork and music, but forgetting to prepare your story? Are you preparing complex villain motivations, but forgetting how your players fit into the story that you're excited about? And third, what is my player's relationship with their character? And in many ways, this one is actually the most important. You may have players that really have no attachment to their character, shrugging when they die and moving on to the next one easily. Likewise, you may have players that would be devastated to lose their character, which may inform how you design encounters. And I'm not saying that if a player is attached to their character, you shouldn't ever target them with an attack, or they should never die, but you can get a sense about what they enjoy about their character, informing you of how to best design each session's tone so that they can get the most out of the experience. Thank you everyone for watching today's episode of Level Up. Ian and I have tons of different games we're excited to dive into. And if you have a favorite that you'd like us to analyze, make sure to put it in the comments down below. If you like this video and you like this content, make sure to let YouTube know. Give us a like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and have an awesome day everyone. Bye-bye now.